So good evening, everybody. My name is Alison Kriel. I'm the founder of Above and Beyond Education, which is a platform that I decided was needed when I was in headship, because there was nowhere for us to connect and to collaborate and to share and ask for help and also to celebrate. My biggest frustration was that there's so many good things going on in education and we don't celebrate it enough with each other. So that's the purpose of the platform. And talking education is one of the main things, one of the things that we'll do. So it's usually going to be on the last Wednesday of every month. But given that it was half term and I spent an awful lot of time talking about well-being, I did not want to interrupt anybody's half-term holiday by having a discussion about education. And so we pushed it on for 1 week to this week, because everybody has now returned. I'm really pleased to see that we've got some wonderful people who are joining us in the discussion. And if you've got any questions, by all means, put it into the chat. And I think Tess will pick up questions. Tess is our community manager. So if you're ever on the platform and you need help, Tess is the person who's going to be engaging with you directly. We've got 3 amazing panelists this evening. You'll notice that there is one person whose name you may not recognize, but she is actually a hero, I have to say, because about 5 o'clock this evening, I got an email from Sufyan to say that he's had this incredible dilemma where he'd been invited by the managing director of Luton Football Club to go and watch the Luton Chelsea football match. And I can't believe that he struggled to choose what to do. But what he did do was he persuaded Rehana Faisal, who is, so Sufyan is the director of the teaching school at the Chiltern Learning Trust, and Rehana is the chair of governance of one of the schools in the Chiltern Trust. So I want to start by saying good evening to Rehana and welcome. It's great to see you here. We've also got Penny Rabiger, who's not only one of my neighbours, but I've got to know through a range of different events. Penny is very active on Twitter and on LinkedIn and comes with incredible experience. She's a teacher and a researcher. She's a governor and a trustee and very involved. I think one of the founders of BAMED. And is also one of the coaches on the anti-racist award at Leeds Beckett University. And then we've got Dan Morrow, who, when I first got to know Dan, was the CEO of Woodland Academy Trust in the East End of London and a bit further out, and has now deserted London and is now the CEO of Dartmoor Multi-Academy Trust. So Penny, Rehana and Dan, welcome. And it's very nice to see you here. So Penny's unmuted herself, which is very handy, because I was going to suggest that Penny kicks off tonight's discussion by introducing herself and talking to us about her initial response to the guidelines which have now been shared by the DFE on the political impartiality in schools. So Penny, maybe you can tell us a bit more about us. You also wrote a tremendous thread on Twitter and on LinkedIn, and it'd be really good for you to take a few minutes just to share your thoughts with us.
Okay, thank you, and thanks everyone. It's great to be here. So I was a teacher for about 10 years, and then was able to become part of the team that set up the Key for school leaders, and I've worked in various social enterprises, charities and whatnot. So I've had this really interesting, unique helicopter view over the sector. And as Alison said, I'm currently researching for my PhD, looking at unlearning racism in schools. So I've been watching quite carefully what's been going on here, and sort of reading quite a lot about the kind of history of education policy and racism within our education system, and watching quite carefully what's been happening across the states. I don't know how many people have been following that, but there's this kind of moral panic about critical race theory and some quite extraordinary ideas about what that actually is. So when I kind of knew that this was coming, because there's been rumblings. Kemi Badenoch, who was, I don't know if she still is, but the Minister for Women and Equality, started talking about, you know, how we mustn't talk about this and we mustn't talk about that. And again, citing Black Lives Matter as the wrong organisation to be involved with or to listen to, and citing critical race theory. And there seems to be a kind of move from government to sort of outlaw these things. There's also a couple of government affiliated organisations that have been chucking out quite a bit of propaganda, sample letters for people's parents to send to school, saying they don't want this taught and they don't want that taught. So one of them is called Don't Divide Us. So yeah, so there it came, and for me, it's really interesting. I feel like it's specifically designed to create fear among teachers and confusion, and it plays to some of the things that came off the back of the Sewell report. So there was a report that was written that has been condemned by anyone who knows anything about education and research and race, but sort of saying they couldn't find any evidence of structural racism. And I think it all ties together. I don't want to think, you know, want you to think I'm some kind of massive conspiracy theorist, but I think all of these things are interconnected. To me, it's this gradual erosion of anything connected to thinking critically. I think it's also very much connected to some of the wider policy moves around stopping people from protesting, some of the moves around the kind of gradual, the marketisation of the education sector in this guise of parental choice and this kind of neutrality and colourblindness and managerialism and bureaucratisation of education, so that what we teach needs to be measured and what we measure needs to be taught accordingly, and anything that sits outside of that is not allowed. And I will stop there.
Thank you, Penny. Off to a bang. So definitely it's going to be a controversial thing for all of us, irrespective of our views. Dan, it'd be really nice to hear your thoughts now, please.
Thank you. Following Penny's always a challenge, to be fair, in the sense that so much of what is said is absolutely spot on and accurate. Now, I think for me, in that leadership space in schools and in trusts and more broadly in settings, the guidance does present a significant challenge. And the challenge that it presents mostly is something Penny's already touched on, which is that sense of fear of getting it wrong, fear of treading outside of what are quite vague lines that feel quite solid. And for those of us who were educators under Section 28, Clause 28, there's a feeling that we are taking some retrograde steps. And I think what's really interesting about where we find ourselves in society, but most particularly in education, is a number of the steps forward that we've achieved in perhaps the last 20 years actually are only based on legal code. So the Equalities Act is a great example. It is a fundamental and hugely important piece, but it's a law. And like all laws, they can be changed, they can be overturned, and they can be eroded in time. And I have a suspicion that some of these aspects and works are around providing the focus, drive, and noise to actually look at our legal protected characteristics again in a different way. And just as there's noise currently in the wider political system around things like human rights actually, and what it means, and using terms like woke in a very negative and pejorative way, it starts to build a picture in which school leaders find themselves really rather conditioned in the last 10 to 15 years around compliance, around making sure we're doing what we're told, which is not necessarily the right thing. once you unpick the guidance, it's rather anodyne, actually. It doesn't really say anything that is particularly controversial, and yet its application is exactly where the controversy will come. And what I mean by that is, it's not going to be about the blog, for example, talked about that came from the Education Hub to support the guidance, was really clear in saying, for example, I'll give you two examples I thought were really interesting. Teachers also should not present opposing views to fundamental underpinnings of our society, like freedom of speech and protection from violence and criminal activity. Well, that's absolutely fine, but the definition of what that means and where we find ourselves in terms of therefore being able to interpret what exactly do we mean by freedom of speech in this space becomes in itself a contested view. And so I suppose as a leader, what I've talked to my head teachers and staff about the implementation of this is continue to do what you've always done, which is be fair, be critical in your thinking, encourage critical thinking in our children and students as they grow into themselves, and just wait for the precedent to be set. And I think, Penny, coming back to you, I wouldn't say I'm a conspiracy theorist, but it does feel like there are various circles that are starting to overlap, and then various Venn diagrams are presenting themselves in terms of what is seeking to be achieved in this, which to an extent, I think, even if you were to take the positive messages that may underpin it, and you know, if we could look at that critically and say, well, I don't disagree with this, and I don't disagree with that, and I don't disagree with the other. However, guidance is always a vehicle for in itself something else. And in this particular instance, we are being instructed by a political body, an elected government, which has a clear agenda, just as all governments do, to be impartial in a criteria set by a political organization. And therefore, there's an ever decreasing circles aspect of this that we need to be mindful of. But I genuinely believe in education, we are very balanced in the way we present things. We do look at ensuring criticality of thinking, not indoctrination. And so in order to ensure we do not fall for this, I think there are two things to consider for leaders in schools and for practitioners in schools. And the first is that actually we do not need to change what we're doing because there is guidance in place that makes it sound as if what we were doing was wrong, when actually once you unpick the guidance, there's very little that I would say any of my staff wouldn't be applying and enforcing at all times as general good practice. And the second point is this, which is we have to be there to challenge some of the institutionalized views that are come through guidance, but in a way that doesn't detract from our position as being leaders of the community and for the community. And therefore, I think that my own position and the position for many of the leaders who I am responsible for and work with me is we'll continue to do what we've always done. And that is, we take it back to the Equalities Act, which is law, and we take it back to the fact that we have a duty to promote and to ensure that we are advancing equality as part of our civic responsibility and indeed public service. And therefore, this guidance may be seeking to put the barriers up, if you like, on a bowling alley, but it doesn't change the fact that, you know, we've been hitting it and getting strikes for years. So we continue to do what we've always done, and we continue to be who we've always been. And I think that will be fundamental. It takes courage, but the true inclusivity is always this. It's about becoming our best selves and doing our best work. And this guidance, I think, is noise and a potential distraction from what inclusivity actually does mean and should mean, and the progress we are making, not just as an education sector, but indeed as a society. But the warning shot is this: everything we have achieved is based on law, and laws change.
Thank you, Dan, as wise as ever, and I hope that lots of teachers hear what you say, although not every CEO is going to provide that guidance, but I think what you said is fair, and yeah, I can only say thank you for saying what you said. Rehana, you are the chair of governors at a girls' school. How did you receive this information?
So first of all, just from my point of view, apologies for people who were expecting to see Sufyan here. I hope I'm a worthy replacement. I'll do my best. So I think I agree with with lots of things that have already been said. Like the other speakers, perhaps wanted to make some connections that occurred to me when I first looked at the guidance that came through. I think it's fair to say that this guidance comes follows kind of potentially quite similar, I think, guidance and a particular direction that we've seen schools moving in terms of so rather than this being about ensuring that schools maintain partisan views, I think I might argue that this is about ensuring that that we uphold views that we deem to be correct, or whatever government is in place deemed to be correct. And I think some of the earlier examples of that particularly impacted the Muslim community. And one of the particular focuses for me is Islamophobia, and I've done quite a bit of work around the PREVENT strategy, the PREVENT duty, and its impact on Muslim communities and Muslim children. And I think if we go back to, I think it was 2011 or thereabouts, and someone can correct me, when we had Theresa May first introduce fundamental British values in the wake, I think, of the, and again, people can correct me, of, I think it was the attack in Westminster, and Theresa May spoke at that time of asserting the superiority of British values, which she later, I think, defined as, and I've written those down, democracy, I forget sometimes, democracy, freedom of law, freedom, human rights, rule of law, and in the way that that's articulated, presented Britain as the forerunner in all of those things. And so in the introduction of that duty, China Mills, in a great essay, if people can find it in a book called The Fire Now, talks about how the way that we teach fundamental British values upholds and privileges whiteness. And I think actually we've seen a trend towards that direction. Certainly those of us who are racialized and those racialized as Muslims have felt the force of that trend. When the PREVENT duty was introduced, which similarly looked at picking out those views that were unpalatable based on this idea that there's a sort of conveyor belt of extremism, and that if we are able to pick out ideas that we dislike, that we think might be dangerous, then we can prevent extremism. Well, it hasn't worked very well, despite what people might argue. In terms of its success, most of the referrals to PREVENT are unworthy. And I think the real challenge, I think, for me, and I'll speak as a parent, as a member of a racialized community, the real fear for me is, I've read quite a few articles that have talked about the chilling effect that this will have on teachers. Muslim communities have been talking about the PREVENT duty and the chilling effect that it's had on us for many, many years. Teachers are, aside from the police, the second biggest preferrer to PREVENT. And clearly, that hasn't worked well. It hasn't worked well in education settings, and it's harmed racialized people and it's harmed Muslims. And I know that there might be people thinking here, well, that's changing a bit because we're having more white young people being referred through PREVENT. This is true, but massively, disproportionately, Muslim young people are being impacted by that legislation. And I think the similarities between this guidance and the PREVENT duty, although obviously it's not kind of legally binding in the same way, is the vagueness of the terms used and the subjectiveness of all of this. I mean, I had a quick read of it before I came back on here, and it said, well, actually teaching facts is perfectly okay. But if I was to say that Winston Churchill is a white supremacist, is that a fact, or is that me blurring the lines? Because I would say that quite sort of objectively that that's a fact. and teaching young people that doesn't harm them, but gives them a fuller understanding of history. But I think I absolutely agree when teachers do say that they feel challenged by this, because the lines are so blurred, and we've seen how it's failed in the past. So I think I'll stop there, just kind of an opening and sort of laying out my initial thoughts and fears about the direction that this could potentially take us.
Thank you, Rehana. I could really feel the emotion in there. And of course, the prevent strategy followed directly after the investigation around Trojan Horse, which meant that initially the work was specifically around the Muslim people, and then eventually it became relevant to all forms, to all faiths and all beliefs. But that took a long time. But the difficulty is that even to this day, there are still some schools who believe that the prevent strategy specifically around the focus is specifically around the radicalization of Islam rather than any form of radicalization, and it's caused tremendous harm to children, to parents, to teachers, who have all had to bear the brunt of it over quite a long period of time. Dan, you want to come in?
Well, because I think that point is exactly at the crux of this, isn't it? Which is, there's what guidance says and what is more generally interpreted as is meant by it. And the idea that those two are very close together is somewhat nonsense, because ultimately we are living in a time where we do have the culture wars, and the culture wars are very much the purview of various press and other people who are interested in division and polarization. But therefore, the idea that imposing guidance, however seemingly well-meaning and sensible, in a febrile atmosphere where people do not have either certainty, clarity, or indeed a shared understanding of what is meant by it, actually therefore leads to interpretation and leads to all of those unconscious biases coming to the fore in how it's therefore implemented and interpreted. And ultimately, these forms of guidance merely serve to prop up rather antiquated power hierarchies and structures in a way that says that to criticize this is political, without ever acknowledging that by accepting those structures, that is in itself a political act. And therefore, I go back to Penny's point actually around this, which is the absolute lack of critical thinking in this, and therefore the really just base understanding of it's this or it's that, without the understanding of therefore the spectrum in between, becomes really challenging. And again, Rehana, I felt really quite moved by how you described your view and your lived experience of this, because ultimately, isn't that the point of this? It's almost trying to take away lived experience as being part of how we communicate, teach, and inform a generation. But our lived experiences are political. They're not political with a capital P. They're not party political. They are political because they have formed our identities. They've formed who we are, and therefore they form our authenticity when we engage with young people. And what we can't have, therefore, is lots of sets of guidance which basically seek to take away our authentic voices, our lived experiences, by almost putting it into a category of that is a political act, when in fact, that's not what politics is about at all.
Penny?
Yeah, I agree with everything. And I think what is interesting also is it's guidance. It's not changing the curriculum, it's not changing law, and it's not changing teacher training. It's guidance. So it's there just in case. It's something that we can pull out, and it has this strong Freudian slip, has this strong thread about what British values are. And so then things that it's this othering as well. So if the things that you do that we don't think are the right things morally or politically or what are Britishly to do, you suddenly become not British. You become not part of the values, British values. And I think there's interesting things like, for example, the guidance says when teaching pupils about racism, teachers should be clear that racism has no place in our society, and help pupils to understand facts about this and the law. However, within facts, they will not accept the fact that racism is structural, and it isn't about, it isn't just located in racist abuse person on person, but it's woven in through, you know, there's a hierarchy, there's a specific way that it's done. You're not allowed to explain how racism came to be, the fact that it is socially constructed, what purpose it serves, and how it's been used to further specific interests. But you can say, you know, you mustn't do a racism, you mustn't be racist, without actually explaining what it is. So there's this whole confusion around what is fact and what is not fact. And facts are opinions, but opinions aren't allowed to be taught. So you can't, I'm not sure that you can even say to children, my opinion is this, or I am politically, to my mind, it makes more sense to say to children, especially teenagers that you're teaching, you know, politically, I am located here. It's something that you do that's responsible when you're doing research, when you're doing so many things. You declare your positionality so that you don't try to be this kind of scientific neutral, because we are the products of everything that we're absorbing and everything that we've learned, and so on and so forth. So I think it is this deliberate kind of, I can't remember the word, obfuscification or something like that. Don't know, I haven't got grand enough words to describe it, but maybe Dan or Rehana can help me out. The right word.
Obfuscation.
Say it again, Dan.
It's obfuscation. It's exactly as Penny describes. It's nonsense dressed up as intelligence, underpinned by what are predominantly majority norms, to suggest that those therefore become the factual record. And I do think, again, actually, the point around fundamental British values is a really key one, which is, if we are to assume that fundamental British values have worth in our curriculum and worth in how we teach young people, then tolerance as one of the fundamental British values must be tolerance of difference of opinion, difference of expression, difference of political view. And as Penny rightly said, the idea that we are moving towards a position where we all have to pretend we are not political animals and not, you know, we're all from this position of centrist neutrality is in itself a political act. And it really is, because actually that goes to power structures and hierarchies as they always have been. But the second point of it surely is, if we're in a position where the guidance is telling us to separate our political views from the issues themselves, that on one level sounds very sensible, doesn't it? But on another level, as Penny just rightly said, the issues themselves are political. So that separation becomes false, anodyne, and effectively takes away, I think, from agency and authenticity of teacher voice. Now, the last thing I just want to say on this, and with many guidance pieces like this, I think the question is always, who is this actually for? Because the vast majority of teachers and educators haven't actually come across this document and won't come across this document in a number of ways. But it plays to a crowd, and it plays to those who want to hear certain things, and it plays to, therefore, the genuine drive by some to seek division and to drive fear into those who challenge power structures. And what we can already see from people like Calvin Robinson or whatever that other person is, Lawrence Fox, is that sort of, you know, in reaction to a teacher who is rightly celebrating a protected characteristic within school, it's, well, what about the impartiality guidance? So it becomes a trope, it becomes a weaponized version of the culture wars, and therefore what it does, it doesn't just instill fear, it gives a reason to say, here we go again, the mob are off, the blob of teachers are doing X, Y, and Z, because there's this entire belief that somehow, because young people tend to want the world to be a better place, that's because their teachers have indoctrinated them to challenge a system. Well, good. Isn't that partly what we're there for? And partly the idea that the system doesn't need to be challenged is the thing that actually, again, in itself is a political statement, and one that we are being asked to ascribe to. But I just find the absolute lack of critical understanding of the terms and knowledge of it that underpin this kind of thing to be so genuinely depressing in a sector which is based on learning and knowledge and becoming more than we are. And so I suppose that there's an anti-intellectualism, I think, which is a thread of this, which is potentially the most dangerous thing, because when we see other educators almost falling for aspects of those wider pieces, then we know it is actually starting to get traction and land. And that in itself is a dangerous piece for me. That's what I'm fearful of.
Penny, prior to us all coming together, we started to have a little conversation around the impactful teacher training, and the fact is that there's been quite a lot of legislation. I think it probably started in the mid-90s, where there have been expectations around how teachers are seen in the classroom, and then of course we have the prevent strategy, and now we've got this new guidance coming in. And of course teachers, there is nothing in our teacher training which is around developing our own critical thinking, our own understanding of each other. And there's a huge amount of othering going on. So how do you think this will impact on teachers in the classroom today in terms of their awareness? So at the moment, whenever I speak to teachers and I ask them about this document, very few of them have heard about it. So that kind of worries me a little bit. And then the other bit is, can you tell us a little bit about the journey that we've gone on in terms of developing of critical thinking skills in our teacher training, and where do you think it needs to go next?
Yeah, I think there's probably people here in the, on screen who know more about this and who actually work in skits, in school-based initial teacher training. But what I can see is certainly with the kind of marketization of education, there came this sort of reeling back some of the gains on thinking about preparing teachers for multicultural classrooms, sort of prepare, also that a lot of, well, all teacher education happened in universities, and universities are usually sites where there's quite a lot of critical thinking, where it's acceptable and encouraged for you to kind of push back, and there's this sense that we're preparing the next generation to do a better job. And I think there's probably a link between it moving more into schools and more of this kind of compliance agenda, compliance around, how teachers need to behave, and this kind of gradual, I think the aims were to sort of make things uniform so that every child went to a decent school, and that all teachers were teaching more or less the same things. But I think it's gone a bit pear-shaped. So since the 90s, yeah, there's been this taking out of any anti-racist education, taking out of preparing children for a multicultural world, and sort of thinking, part of that preparing children for multicultural classrooms was to think deeply about what is happening now in Britain, and where are children coming from, and where are children, from generations past, how have they come to be here, and an acceptance also that, that Britain is part of a global world, and there's been a gradual erosion of that as well with Brexit, and with this doubling down on this sort of resurgence of colonial thinking. And yet there's some good stuff in the chat here as well to say that citizenship teaching was really, citizenship was in the curriculum, although it was never said what was meant to be taught as part of citizenship. It was definitely a thread, and now it's a bit kind of haphazard. So I think those things are problematic, and I think, yes, teachers are not taught to be critical thinkers, and there's no time in the curriculum to have sort of critical discussion. You have to work really hard. There are schools that do it. You have to work really hard to create some kind of discussion and critical thinking, rather than sort of pouring in like Dickens's Gradgrind, pouring knowledge into vases that are all sitting there waiting to receive. So over time, that's been eroded. And I've also, every teacher that I've spoken to since that guidance came out, and I've been doing quite a lot of coaching calls and whatnot, they've all said, what guidance? I don't know what you're talking about. And schools that I work with on that anti-racist award, I said to them specifically, you do need a kind of mitigation plan for when they come for you for being woke, because they will come. There will be a complaint, and it's enough that there's one, and then Ofsted will be there, or whoever will be there. So I think it is, we've got a real fight on our hands to keep hold of initial teacher training so it doesn't become this kind of factory.
Yeah. Dan and Zoe, I see your hands up. There's I want us to just talk about children and the pupils for a moment, because one of the points that we talked about is that we want our young people to become we're preparing them to be great citizens and to understand their civic responsibility. And part of that is for them to understand that it's against the law to discriminate against anybody based on the 9 protected characteristics. And then just a reminder, that's age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnerships, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation. So for the children to understand that, there are 2 things that we need from them. One is for the children to understand their own rights, their entitlement to their uniqueness, irrespective of their faith or their gender or you know, who they are as individuals. And the only way that children can, you know, how are we going to enable those children to understand their rights as individuals if we can only teach these things in a partisan way? That's a real challenge, I think, for any teacher. And then the other side of that is for the children who might consider themselves to be normal. So, for example, the argument that we've seen on Twitter recently is about a gay teacher who was very proud of being gay, and the fact and that one of the pupils was a boy, came dressed in a dress, and that really led to quite uncomfortable discussion. So it's basically saying that there's one form of normal. So how do we get the children to be accepting of each other when we're teaching in a partisan way? And how do we help the children to understand what their rights are as an individual? Where are the children in all of this? How are they going to grow up into critical thinkers if we're not allowing them to have critical thinking skills? I don't know, who would like to answer that?
I think that's a really interesting question, Alison, for 2 reasons. And I think this all kind of loops in on itself. The children get this better than many of the adults, is the truth. And, you know, my kids now are both at university and older, and they have re-educated me in a number of ways about my own conscious and unconscious bias. And the biggest challenge I get is from my kids, who will say to me, I mean, the joke is, isn't it, that, you know, on Twitter and various other platforms, I might be seen as this woke warrior, but according to my kids, I am backwards in so many ways. And I think actually the issue does not stand with them. The issue stands with the adults. But also, Twitter is a good example of this. Twitter is not a reality or reflection of the entire teaching profession. And yet the impact of it is felt and is quite important. So I've got a duality with that platform in some ways. I met incredible people like yourself and Raj and others who have enriched my life, but equally I spend so much time cross and irritated and bothered. But just circling back to the children aspect, I think the bit about the Equalities Act that I think has led to this is there's 2 aspects of our public duty around the Equalities Act. The first is to ensure that we eliminate discrimination. And going back to Penny's point, that's the sort of easy bit, which is, you know, kind hands, kind words, etc., or this action is good, this action is bad. The bit which has become the contested space and has led to this guidance for me is the bit that says we have to advance equality. Because actually, in the advancement of equality, we have very different views of what that means. And we have different views as a profession, we have a wide spectrum. And I think it's in the advancing of equality rather than the reducing discrimination, which may well be 2 sides of the same coin, but one is much less contested currently than the other. And so where does the focus come? The focus comes on And again, those of us old enough to remember, it just has absolute shades of, it's political correctness gone mad. It's I'm not even allowed to say this. Am I an endangered species as a middle-aged white male? It's all nonsense we've heard in so many guises for so many years and generations. So I suppose the other point around the children is, this is not new. This is a reiteration and a remanifestation of views and controls that we've seen in every generation, in every decade. And therefore, I suppose my overall answer, Alison, is the children will be okay because they tend to get better every generation at understanding who they are and who they're becoming. The difficulty is, by having this shadow over the work of genuinely advancing equality, it doesn't go at the pace, speed, or depth that it should. And that's the true issue with this. I don't think it's going to be retrograde, although I come back to my always fear around what we've achieved in advance, which is it is legal, therefore it can be undone. But at the same time, the kids are okay. And we need to listen more to them than to right-wing agitators on Twitter who have their own agenda and no doubt paymasters.
Absolutely. But the argument goes beyond Twitter. So, for example, at the moment, looking at what's happening in Ukraine, the children are seeing a war live through TikTok, and they've got a lot of information that's been given to them, and there are lots of teachers saying, how do we teach the children about what is happening in the Ukraine? So presumably, partisan views go out of the window here, because there's a potential that, well, Britain is openly supporting the Ukraine. So there is no partisan, there is bias. There is absolute bias. So how do we teach the children about something like the Ukraine in a partisan way? Because that's what this new guidance is telling us to do. And if we don't, if we stick with the British values thing, Britain is supporting Ukraine because it's aligned with British values and all of those sorts of things, does that set a precedence on how we teach about all wars? There is real conflict here. Penny, do you maybe want to say, or Rehana, would you like to say something on that?
Yeah, if I can come in there, I do think that word partisan is a massive red herring in all of this. And what we are really talking about is regulating thoughts and ideas within school and within the student body. And actually, I think the Ukraine example is a really good one. And if we contrast that with the response to young people racialized young people by and large, showing concern about the conflict in Palestine, and how and the way that they were disciplined within schools and had a response right from the top of government to tell that this young people is not the way to behave, and these are not the ideas that you should be holding. So this is very much about regulating ideas and telling young people what is right and wrong. And I absolutely agree with Dan that the kids are okay, but they're not okay. The kids are great. We all learn so much from them, but I think we all here, myself included, have a lot to learn from racialized young people, Black and brown young people who are not and have never been safe in schools. And this kind of guidance compounds that hurt. I have spent a lot of time hearing from young people, and actually, if I'm very honest, personally, in the way that we self-censor, and children will tell you how they self-censor for the way that they might be perceived if they say certain words, or if they, if they perform certain actions, they self-regulate, that they know that there are certain parts of themselves that they can't bring to school because those parts are deemed dangerous, scary, worrying, and so on and so forth. I'll ask a Black boy with dreadlocks how safe he is in schools, or with an afro, or a Muslim child who habitually, like me, might say Allahu Akbar every so often, and the kind of responses that they get. And I suppose going back to what I was saying earlier, we do have really good evidence about what this type of guidance, what these ideas do. And although I am concerned for teachers, my largest concern will always be with the children, because, you know, ultimately they will be the ones who I think will feel the brunt of the guidance, because I think what we will see, and what this is a reaction to, is some of the fears that around the discussions that have been growing around racial equity. And I think this is a reactionary response. So as schools have just started to, and I think none of us who are involved in kind of anti-racist work, none of us actually think that the things that are happening in schools are going far enough, but we are starting to have those conversations about equity and inclusion and how to create anti-racist spaces. And I think this is a reactionary response from the government to that, to say, well, actually, no, we're not having that.
There's also the elephant in the room. So many people would like to talk about the fact that I agree with you on everything, Dan, except that I don't think that the children are okay. And that's because we were led to, and teachers will still, the majority of teachers in this country will still say that the reason why we have the prevent strategy was because of the radicalization of around Islam. But my understanding is that the biggest area, the biggest concern around radicalization is from the far right. And whereas before it wasn't okay to talk about being racist, you know, it was just, there was no explanation why it wasn't okay, but it was just uncool to be racist. Whereas now it is perfectly okay for people to talk about the fact that they're racist and proud. It's okay to be racist. And there's a growing movement. We see that happening in the States. And often what happens in the States, we see following into Britain. And I'd even go as far as saying that there's clear radicalization of right-wing thinking, extreme right-wing thinking in the House of Commons and in the House of Lords. So this is a problem for all of us. We don't have balanced thinking. And I think that some children are okay. A lot of children are okay, but there is a lot of work that's been done through online gaming and recruiting and all of that kind of stuff. We know how much time young people spend gaming, and that's become the perfect place to recruit unsupervised young people.
Actually, I think that is exactly the point, to be fair. I suppose when I said kids are okay, I mean, generationally, I think there is still going to be progress. But it does come back to Rehana's point, actually, and the Equalities Act, and where I see the pushback coming. To eliminate discrimination, don't be racist, tick, most people can understand and abide by that. To advance equality, i.e. become anti-racist, that is the contested area now, isn't it? Because I think for many people, it's therefore seen as, oh, but that's going too far. When of course that is political, but it is political with a small p around progressing into a space where all of us can feel safe. And I take the point completely, I really do.
I want to comment on that, don't be racist as well, and the critical thinking is that we don't have the racial literacy to understand what racism is. So don't be racist gets boiled down to, don't get caught saying something that is offensive. And we don't even understand, you know, we still think that a person finding it offensive is just being sensitive and it's just banter, right? There's, you know, so many contortions and confusions. I think the other thing to pick up, which is important to me, is about it's about recognizing power and knowing, you know, having the tools to question authority. And the way that government policy seems to be going with behaviour hubs, with zero tolerance and so on and so forth, is that we mustn't question authority. And so we need children to be seen and not heard. They need to be silent. They need to absorb the information. I think, again, this is less at primary, but secondary is a really harsh environment for a lot of children. Not all schools, obviously, but I think the leaning towards an accepted norm that schools should be places where you don't question authority. It's really worrying, because I think we need to give children and young people good tools for pushing back, for finding holes in logic. And the irony is, you know, we've got people in authority that are questionable, that don't keep to their own rules that they set, that it's just a mess. And young people do see that. And I do agree that the children are not okay, because our schools are not places of safety for so many children. You know, racially minoritized children, children who are gay, children who are transgender, children who have opinions. They're not safe places at all. And we have a massive mental health crisis on our hands. Teachers and students are suffering massively. So I want to think that they will be okay. And thankfully there is social media, and there are places where they are sourcing a lot of their information. You know, one of the joys of being at home with my children was being educated by them and finding out where they're learning their knowledge from. And it ain't from school, you know. The things that are really politically empowering and will set them up as good citizens and anti-racist and everything that we want for them, it doesn't come from school, unfortunately.
No, children will always communicate with each other, and then of course, you know, most children over the age of 8 now have a phone, and if they've got a phone, they know about everything, whether we like it or not. They know about everything, and so we need to make it safe for them to be able to talk about and ask questions in a constructive way, and to, you know, develop those critical thinking skills. We've got a couple of questions from that were sent in advance, and one of them was, does anyone else have concerns that this is being used to challenge trans inclusion and teaching resources created by organisations that Stonewall being used in schools? So there is a real problem around transphobia and trans inclusion. The DfE actually recommend the resources from Stonewall, but we've got transphobia. So how do we challenge that? How do we go forward from here? Because this, you know, we talked about race today, but it's actually about all 9 characteristics, not just race.
I think for me, Alison, the key there is around, it goes back to, we have a duty around all of the protected characteristics to eliminate discrimination and to promote equality. And therefore, as school leaders, as classroom practitioners, we need to be very conscious of the organizations we work in, the prevailing ethos and philosophy, and how we can be part of that. And so ultimately, I think you're spot on, that none of the issues around how we're increasingly seeing the sort of unenlightened approach to progress and progressiveness being othered as woke and othered as being somehow dismissive or anti-state, as it were. I just honestly think the way to do it is just to ignore the noise and crack on. So ultimately, it hasn't affected my leadership, and it won't affect my leadership, and therefore it won't affect the ethos and culture of the trust I am privileged to lead, and therefore the people who work with me.
And you're a strong leader with a strong moral compass, and that's absolutely brilliant, but that's not the case throughout the country. And I think that there is a time when parents may start using this could become the stick to beat a teacher with, and we see it happening. We already know what the headlines are going to be in some newspapers. We know how it might be reported on some breakfast morning TV programs. We see these things happening, the misreporting, the deliberate misreporting. And I think that it's only a question of time before governors are going to be having to listen to complaints from parents and from pupils because a teacher a teacher may have said something which is not considered to be partisan. So Rehana, maybe you can help us to know what your guidance here would be for governors if a parent were to challenge. So on the one hand, we're saying we want our children to be pro-inclusive, we want them to be good citizens, we want them to understand the 9 characteristics, and then someone says, but I didn't want my child to learn about X, Y, or Z, and now they've learned about it, and they put in their official complaint. Where do governors go?
Well, I don't think I'm going to be particularly helpful, because I do think that we're in we are school leaders, and I absolutely, you know, I feel in many ways a bit like Dan, and just think, well, do you know what? I don't really care what you're saying. We're going to carry on doing the right thing for our students. But in practical terms, obviously, Alison, I think we've got to be pragmatic, that there will be times where, and you talked about a stick to beat the teacher with, but what does that sort of mean in turn for the young person? And that will often mean, I think, is withdrawing support for a young person, because that support is going to be framed as partisan. So I think as a parent, as a school governor, as you know, somebody who cares deeply about the communities that I live in and move within, I think we have just got to continually remind ourselves and put at the forefront the safety of our young people. And that's got to, I think, kind of be the base from which we build our arguments from. And that's not to say that there is going to be a kind of fail-safe route that we can follow that will stop us getting into trouble. I don't think that will be the case. And I think there will be certain schools in certain areas that will have a much bigger challenge with this than others. And we've all alluded to some of those challenges. But I think our arguments rest on our duty to look after our young people. And if that means that we provide trans young people with a safe and supported structure, that's what we do in schools. If that means that we provide safe spaces to talk about issues that are important to our young people, then we must find ways of doing that, and doing that cares and nurtures for them.
Absolutely. And of course, if we don't do that, the guidance will come on the street, and that can be a dangerous place to learn. So we either make it safe for children to ask their questions, or they'll find out in a way that isn't always going to be, that's definitely not going to be partisan and could be dangerous. So I think we're coming to the end. One of the things that came through was a request. I would like to create an info sheet for my fellow governors, but that can also be used by teachers at schools where I'm a governor. Is there anyone else planning this, and would they like to collaborate? So I'm not going to ask everybody to raise hands or anything like that now, but I do think that that if rather than each school working in isolation, and this is one of the reasons why I founded Above and Beyond, because everyone works by themselves. We're all working so hard by ourselves. Why don't we come together sometimes and collaborate and share our ideas and produce something that is supportive of everyone? So if you are going to be writing guidance for your governors, which can then be used by the teachers and could probably then become a statement or a policy that will be shared with parents, because parents need to understand what the law is, what their rights are as parents, but also what the school's going to be doing. So marrying all of that together. If anyone would like to come together and collaborate on that, I can see people are putting their names into the chat group, and I'm sure Tess will bring it to Tess. Will you just save all of the chat so we've got anybody's name? And if anyone, quite a few people have made apologies about not being able to come today, but we'll be watching this back on YouTube later. If anyone would like to be part of that working party, then we will bring the names together and we will facilitate it, and it'd be really great to see schools supporting each other on this, and we'll be safer. Rather than it being one school being in isolation, becoming the test case, there is power in a group of people coming together to collaborate in this kind of way.
So Zoe in the chat said we're running a training on political impartiality on the 30th of March. So maybe Zoe, you could put, if it's open to other people, if you could put that in the chat, I'm sure people would love to join that as well.
I've put a link in the chat and it's open to everybody to join, absolutely. So
Zoe,
it's Lee and Lee's on the call as well. Hi, Lee.
that's just totally wonderful. Thank you, Lee, and thank you, Zoe. Zoe, you had your hand up earlier. Was there something that you wanted to add?
No, I think really it was just clarification around the teacher training and things like that. I'm very privileged to be in a position of working for a suburb association and an ITT college. So from my perspective, we're constantly at the moment drumming into students about making sure the classroom is inclusive, looking at the idea of decolonising curriculums and all of these kinds of things. And I also work on a Teach First programme where they have to work with their communities, identify what community cohorts they work with. So not all schools do this, not all university colleges provide this, but there is some hope, because I just it felt really bleak at one stage. And I was like, I know where there's some good practice going on. It is out there, but it's about broadening that as well, isn't it? And helping more places sort of see the light of the kind of training that needs to happen.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Zoe. And thank you to you and everyone else who's joined us today. I want to say heartfelt gratitude to Rehana and to Penny and to Dan for being excellent panelists, and to Tess for facilitating today's event. Our next one will be on the last Wednesday of March. If you'd like to ever be on a panel, we always look for 3 people. We look for diversity of voices, and we want people speaking from all levels. So this isn't just about school leaders, it's about teachers. We need to hear teacher voices, and we need to hear the voices of support staff as well. But it's very much about people working within education, and governors, of course, governors are, you know, an integral part of that. So if you'd like to be on a panel, please let me know, and I would love you to be here soon. Thank you very much. Good night, everyone.